Justin Trudeau faced some tough questions on the future of Alberta oil production at the town hall meeting he held this week in Calgary. And with Donald Trump resurrecting the Keystone XL Pipeline project and oil prices on the rise, the future of Canada's energy sector is very much up for discussion. So, to help get us the lay of the land, we welcome in Edmonton, Alberta, Wenran Jiang, Director of the Canada-China Energy and Environment Forum. He's also Global Fellow with the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars. And in Calgary, Alberta, Kerry Tate, reporter with the Globe and Mail. And we're delighted to welcome both of you back to TVO tonight. I want to start by just putting up a map and showing everybody the proposed Keystone XL Pipeline. There it is right there. Starting right near Edmonton, Alberta, and coming south, you can see the checkered line indicating the southern trajectory of the pipeline and also the existing pipelines where they are in place. $8 billion project carrying more than 800,000 barrels of Alberta oil a day to refineries in Texas. And of course, we all know it was President Barack Obama that killed that project back in November of 2015. But Kerry, let me start with you. With quite a flourish, Donald Trump decided in the very first week of his presidency to put that one back on the agenda. Do you have any idea whether or not the Canadian government had a heads up that, in fact, President Trump was going to reverse President Obama?
I don't know if they had the heads up, as in it was coming the next day. But President Trump, during the campaign, was very, very warm to industry, where we knew that Hillary Clinton was not. So if she was elected, people didn't expect it to go anywhere, and hopes were that Trump would. So it was basically a guessing game, with people guessing yes.
Wenran Jiang, how significant do you think the Keystone XL Pipeline could be to the Alberta economy?
Well, this is one very important dimension. The Alberta economy, as we know, to a certain extent, Canadian economy very heavily depend on oil and energy sectors. And in the past couple of years, we've been in a very bad downturn. Alberta alone turning from the most prosperous economic growth, income growth, population growth province to almost to the bottom now. So it is coming as a good news. But remember, in the bigger picture of things, other than the transportation, future opening of the market for our shaping the oil market, the energy market itself, is yet to recover fully in terms of price. And so we have to be optimistic, only cautiously at the moment.
I appreciate that, but Kerry, what are people saying in Alberta about how many jobs the project could potentially create north of the border?
I think the federal government's estimate is about 4,500 construction jobs. What people have always argued with the pipelines is that the spin-off jobs are a really important part of that too, whether it's serving coffee at Tim Hortons or larger jobs across the country.
Okay, 4,500 construction jobs is certainly nothing to sneeze at, but Wenran, we know that Donald Trump has already said that his very strong position is when this pipeline gets built, it has to use American steel or else it isn't going to happen. Does that mean that this will not be the economic boost for Alberta and for Canada that we might have originally thought?
Well, Steve, that's a very good question. Now we have the approval. We have all the cameras focusing on Trump, making this a big deal in the very first week of his presidency. But now the devil is in the details. What it means for Trump to say, buy America, hire America. As far as we know, TransCanada in its original plan, or the current plan, is about only having about 50% of pipes procured in the United States. Others are buying from other countries like India, Italy, maybe China as well. Are they going to force Canada in this quote-unquote renegotiation? Remember, this is the very important phrase. It's not a blanket approval. It's going to be reopened, approved, but yet renegotiated in a sense on American terms. They want to extract more benefits. So we have to look into this in detail and see what Canada can get out of that, because he's claiming 28,000 jobs out of this whole pipeline thing on the Keystone, and we're not adding a lot. So the bargaining is yet to start. I think this is important.
All right, Kerry, let me do what is admittedly here a speculative follow-up question, but I mean, can you imagine the government of Canada saying, well, you know what? We were 50-50 on the pipeline before President Trump, and if you insist on 100% American steel, our interest well, it might be just a little bit less. Can you imagine us taking that position?
Well, it's going to matter how much power the Canadian government has in this renegotiation. Importantly, it's a corporate deal with TransCanada, and then the companies that will sign on to the pipeline. In Canada, it has the approval already. So that's a big trick, is who President Trump thinks he's negotiating with.
Well, good point. And I guess we also have to point out that his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, he's got a little bit of experience in the oil and gas business, so presumably Trump puts him on this case big time, yes?
Well, yes, he's obviously coming out of the top spot in Exxon, and then that makes him essentially the top of Imperial Oil up here, which has a huge interest in what happens in Keystone.
Indeed.
So it might depend whether he said, it doesn't really quite work that way.
Understood. Now, Kerry, tell us as well, the opposition presumably will resurrect itself now that the pipeline seems to be resurrecting as well. Mm-hmm. Where do you suppose the opponents of this project are going to focus their energies in the days ahead?
Well, there's a long stretch, and we saw where the opponents were before. It wasn't necessarily physically on the pipeline. It was in Washington and in other spots across the country. But there's also now a playbook out of Standing Rock on how to more effectively interfere and block. So it's going to depend whether this comes down to just State Department and environmental regulations, or if the United States is going to play ball with people who really, really don't want it and come up with environmental or actual physical reasons why not to build it.
And Wenren, what do you suppose the government of Canada will do in an attempt to take on those opponents of this project now?
Well, this will create some dilemma because Justin Trudeau and his cabinet may well claim now they got 3 pipelines under their watch being approved and going ahead to claim credit. But at the same time, they're quite aware of the fact that on both sides of the borders in the United States and Canada, environmental groups, native groups, opposition to fossil energy development forces, they will be rallied around not only the Keystone Pipeline. Remember, the Dakota Access Pipeline was also approved and going ahead, which is even more controversial, proven, as we know, in recent months in the United States. So this is going to be building up to be a fight. So the Liberals are in the middle trying to promote itself as an image of promoting important, one of the most vital sectors in Canadian economy, at the same time, how they can accommodate all the environmentalists, because they're not going to cut regulations as much as what Trump is going to do. Using his words, they're going to cut regulation approval process in a massive amount. Maybe if he has his way, 75%, if not 100%. So here we go. I think the Liberals may have some persuasion to do to the opposition at this point.
I'm sure it did not escape the attention of either one of you that the Prime Minister of Canada was in your neck of the woods. Actually, Karen, you were there, I think, to watch Justin Trudeau's town hall in Calgary. Let's play a little snippet of, of what he ran into there, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
I have said repeatedly in many situations, okay, you can if you're going to ask me a question, you might want to hear the answer. Yeah, so I have repeatedly said that yes, the responsibility of any Canadian Prime Minister is to get our resources to market, and yes, that includes our oil sands, fossil fuels. We need to get those to market. I've also said that we need to do that in a responsible, sustainable way. That you cannot separate what's good for the environment and what's good for the economy.
A somewhat dramatic welcome to Calgary, Alberta for the Prime Minister, Kerry. How did that event go?
That was a really interesting event. The clip that you just showed came right at the end. Prior to that, the crowd was really quite warm to him. It was at the University of Calgary. There were a smattering of protesters in the crowd. But at the very, very end, these very warm the very warm audience members really turned on the Prime Minister. He selected a person who was clearly going to ask a question in a more hostile way. He was wearing a Make America Great Again hat, I Heart Oil Sands shirt. And the crowd really, really supported this question, even in the hostile way. They really got behind him, cheering. And then they booed the beginning of Mr. Trudeau's answer. He eventually won them over, but it was quite an eruption, and it didn't reflect what happened at the rest of the meeting, but it was definitely the most noteworthy part.
Interesting, but let me follow up on that, though. You know, it was a week or two ago that Hayley Wickenheiser retired from being the fantastic hockey player and representative for Canada that she has been, when that happened in Edmonton. And at the Oilers home game, they played a video before her ceremony, and Kerry, on that occasion as well, when Prime Minister Trudeau's face came up on the screen in Edmonton, you know, there was big-time booing. Has the bloom gone off the rose in Alberta for the Trudeau government?
Well, it's Calgary, where some of the Liberal support came out of, and of course some in Edmonton, and it's torn. There are some people who recognize that if you want to have the energy industry continue to grow, then you need to work on the things that concern the opponents if you want to win them over. Others see the opponents as always going to try to get in the way, always block everything, and have turned on the Prime Minister. But you also have to remember, it's not as though everybody in Alberta was a supporter to begin with. No,
fair enough, although he did win seats this past election, maybe as many as his father won in the last several elections that he fought out there. In any event, Wenran, let me move to another thorny problem that I suspect the PM has, and that is his government has approved Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain and Enbridge's Line 3. And I'm wondering how tough it's going to be for the Prime Minister to get oil sands bitumen to market, which he wants to do, and meet the government's environmental agenda, which it also wants to do. How thorny a problem is that?
Well, this is the balancing game, as we have discussed earlier. You talk about this Prime Minister showing up in Edmonton, Calgary, Alberta. Remember, he won not a lot of seats here in Alberta, and Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Jason Kenney's 2 seats are up for re-election. So there's a lot of politics. But more importantly, when he is in Alberta, he has to be careful about the language of oil and oil sands phase out. So he's taking some of those back. Very sensitive issue. Even we have the Keystone in the prospect to be renegotiated, reapplied by TransCanada. But the Enbridge Line 3 is a significant line all the way to Wisconsin, which will be a total of well over 700,000 barrels capacity per day. That will be adding, once the replacement line is done, it will be adding over 370,000 per day capacity, whereas Kinder Morgan, with current line carrying just over 300,000 barrels to Vancouver, will be more than double that. So with these 3 pipelines, it will be actually very good for a potential, say, 5 or 7 years down the road. If they're all being built, it will be very good for potential oil sand development. And yet the resistance, especially for Kinder Morgan line around Vancouver area, cannot be underestimated. Even now, BC government is on board. So I think even this may carry into the next election, and the federal government is very careful trying to balance between both. I think it's going to be difficult, and there will be a lot of hurdles to go before we actually get there.
Kerry, let me follow up on the environmental side of the equation, and that is that both the PM and, of course, the oil patch as well, as you would expect, have said that they have made innovative and technological advances in environmental sustainability, which means the oil sands are a lot more environmentally friendly now than they once were. Can you give us some, perhaps, independent verification as to whether or not you think that's true?
Well, that's a tricky question. There's nothing that, recently that has absolutely changed the game. These have been very incremental steps, and they come really, really, really slowly as they develop technology. And then on the flip side of that, as you do continue to expand in the oil sands, the entire emissions increase, not necessarily just the per barrel. And that's where part of the fight is, that you might not be bringing down emissions, you're just bringing it down per barrel. But there's nothing that has, dramatically changed the game.
Wenran, how much more do you think could be done to make the oil sands more environmentally sustainable?
Steve, actually, I do want to comment on this particular point to just complement what Kerry already mentioned. It's very very important to actually remember and remind our viewers, if we don't have these pipelines, the oil sands development continues and they're going on real. We're talking about either to the west coast or to the current Enbridge Line 3, or without Keystone, the oil will flow through tens of thousands of rails by rail, and those is higher cost and higher risk. The current pipeline technologies do add a lot of safety methods through is still the best and the safest way of transporting it. So the broader issue now on oil sands energy emission and the environmental footprint cannot be only discussed within Canada. I have a serious problem with our current Canadian discourse on energy development within this country, because if you look at globally, comparing with our oil sands development footprint with, say, heavy oil development in California heavy oil, or with Venezuela, or especially with the 70%, close to 70% of energy consumption in China all coming out of the coal. The global picture is, if we want to deal with the global warming issues, care about global environmental footprints, we need to look globally. So in that bigger picture, Canadian oil sands having a very little, a very marginal and very comparatively low carbon footprint in comparison with the dirty burning of coal or the dirty extraction of Venezuela heavy oil. We need to look at this bigger picture to say, if we do globally, should we actually do something about in that regard? We can ship every kind of fossil energy other than coal to China, for example, and replace their coal use, and the global energy development and the CO2 emission footprint would look better rather than just looking our backyard.
Okay, that's the environmental story. Let me switch now and talk about another, irritant in this situation, and that is the notion of whether Canada's First Nations are on board with the Keystone Pipeline project. Carrie, where does it stand today in terms of acceptance from Indigenous communities?
I think when you're looking at the Indigenous communities and pro or opposed, the biggest one to be looking at is Kinder Morgan, actually, more than Keystone, because that's the one that goes through more land and where you're seeing more opposition out of BC. It's not necessarily the Keystone where you'll see the same level of backlash.
Not the same level of backlash, but have you heard anything? I mean, certainly in the United States we have heard that there are Indigenous groups there deeply concerned about this, but how about in Canada?
Well, that might be the point they might make, is that if you're expanding the oil sands, then you have the potential damage from that, or what they see as potential damage, not necessarily along the physical line of the pipe.
Gotcha. Wenren, do you think there is a role for the Canadian government to play here, trying to find the common ground among all the differing interests here, namely the Indigenous protesters, the United States, TransCanada Corporation, who are, of course, behind the Keystone XL? What's the federal government's role in all of that?
Well, I think the federal government has to come in, strongly support the reapplication efforts by TransCanada. As Kerry mentioned, on the Canadian side of the pipeline, there's not a lot of issues there. It's primarily further down in the United States. And Canada can play the card, and Canadian government, this will be a part of the NAFTA negotiation with President Trump for sure, saying if we provide what he called vital energy independence, and Keystone is part of that independence for the United States, we wanted them to have concessions on other overall trade relations with Canada. We see this as an opportunity, as a benefit from the United States. But at the same time, I think Canadian government is more sensitive, clearly now, in comparison with the Trump administration that is more inclined to accommodate some of the environmental concerns. And that's being said, Canadian side's issue is less controversial, I think, in terms of Keystone. And the Trans Mountain Line by Kinder Morgan, the executive over there has done so much work. I think the government, they already supported it. They already approved it. They need to work with both Alberta and the BC government towards the smaller, it's not a large group, a smaller group of Aboriginal people who are still against the Kinder Morgan pipeline. I think that's the major challenge in the coming month and years.
Let me follow up with this then. We know 15 months ago the chances of this pipeline, the Keystone XL, being built were 0. If you consider 0 is it's not going to happen, 10 is for sure it's going to happen, it's a slam dunk, where are we today on that scale of 0 to 10?
I would say 7 to 8. The remaining 2 or 3 factors are this so-called renegotiation of Donald Trump's always want to have a good deal for the Americans. And at the end of the day, he knows on a broader strategic sense, this is good for the United States, and he may just go along with a better bargain out of the entire equation.
Understood. Kerry, let's also just take a moment here and speak to the fact that oil prices have started to, climb back up. And I wonder if you could, from your perch there in Alberta, give us a sense about what kind of an impact or how that news is being received in Western Canada.
I think in Western Canada, for a while now, you've seen people recognize that you have to be cautious, where before you would have seen a lot more excitement. But they really, really took it on the chin, and now there's a lot more patience, I think, out west.
So they are not throwing their Stetsons up in the air just yet?
Not quite. The lesson that hasn't been quite forgotten yet.
Wenran, how about you on that same question?
Yeah, I think the better part of this is to look at the long-term diversification of our energy market, not just saying, oh, we got Keystone, we got good time because U.S. is on board with us on the energy thing. We still face the problem of discount. The Western Canada Select sells the discount and WTI. The long-term solution is look at West Coast access to get our oil to the global market that's more in line with the Brent index rather than looking at enclosed, totally North American trading, because U.S. at the end of the day still just one single exporter destination for us. We need to think much broader on the West Coast side. I think that will be a better way to think strategically.
Understood. Kerry Tate from the Globe and Mail and Wenran Jiang, the Global Fellow from the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's so good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.